This is for Tuesday, March 27th. So, as I said before, there are three different systems that are important to know: the immune system, the endocrine system, and the nervous system. Today, we're just going to look at the systems that are found in various organisms. This will be important for your EOC. And then also just going to give you a little bit of information about the way that the human nervous system set up. And then also we're going to talk about reflexes, which are very important. So the vertebrate brain is organized into regions, and each of those regions have a different function. So for example, we have the frontal lobe, which is part of your personality. You have the parietal lobe, which is where your speaking and your hearing and your language acquisition is. Your occipital lobe, which is part of your vision. But it's important that all organisms are actually able to respond to stimuli. So even a single cell organism has an ability to respond to the stimuli within its environment and determine what the appropriate response is to be able to respond. And then most of our multicellular organisms have some type of system of neurons. It may be more of clusters of neurons like the ganglia, or it could actually be a full organ like the brain. So the simplest organisms that we can talk about that have nervous systems would be your cnidarians. This is like your jellyfish. And what they have is a nerve net. It's just a series of interconnected nerve cells. And so the nerve is just a bundle of axons from multiple nerve cells. And so when we kind of think about the jellyfish, you can kind of see that it moves in a undulating kind of structure together at once. And then your sea stars also have a nerve net, but it occurs within each arm. And then there's like these radial nerves that go down, plus they have the nerve ring that goes around the center. And cool fact, there's a special type of sea star that you can cut off its arm and it will grow the entire organism back. Pretty cool. So here you see our hydra, which is an example of a cnidarian. You can see that nerve net. You see that it's going all over the organism. As well as here you can see our echinoderm, which would be our sea star. You see that we have the nerve ring here, and then we have, of course, those radial nerves that come out from it, going down each of the arms of the sea star. So one of the really important things is that a bilaterally symmetrical organism, okay, as in an organism that has a left and a right side that are the exact same, and they're bilateral because that's the only place that you could cut the organism and still have them symmetrical on both sides, usually exhibits something called cephalization. Cephalization means that we are clustering the sensory organ to the front of the body. So that would be the formation of a brain. So our simple cephalized organisms, like our flatworms, they still have that central nervous system and they have brain, but then they also have these longitudinal nerve cords that come out from it. And we're going to look at a diagram of the flatworms in just a moment. So here you can see that flatworm. Here you can see that they have this little eye spot. It's not really an eye, but it is this way for the planera to respond to light differences. They do have a brain, and then they also just have like these nerve cords and then these transverse net nerve cords that allow the connection between both of the different nerve cords and allow the connection between the whole organism. Here we look at the annelid, the leech. You see that we have all these little ganglia along its kind of nerve cord, and each one of these can actually integrate, as well as they also have a brain. So as we just saw with that other annelid, annelids and arthropods are segmentally clustered, and they have these little kind of ganglia. Now you guys have the same ganglia and they work with your reflexes, but within that ganglia, it is made up of interneurons that are able to integrate or analyze the incoming sensory information to determine the appropriate motor response for each signal. So the way that the nervous system is organized traditionally kind of correlates with the life cycle. If an organism is sessile, which means that it's non-mobile, it just kind of stays in the sand, then it's probably going to have a very simple nervous system. But if you think about a octopi that has a very sophisticated system, it's got eyes, it's got to be able to capture and trap prey, it's going to have a more complicated system, and so it's going to have that brain, and it's going to be, significantly more complicated. So As we said before, the whole point of the peripheral nervous system is to bring all the sensory information in. And once it comes in from the peripheral nervous system, it goes into the spinal cord and then makes its way up to your brain. Well, the problem is there's some types of things that are dangerous for us. So for example, your hand. If you put your hand on the hot stove, it's very dangerous for you to have your hand there because of course you're burning your skin, you're hurting your nerves, there's muscle damage, all kinds of problems there. So we need to be able to respond quickly. And so what happens is in a reflex is your body's automatic response to a stimulus. So when you put your hand on that hot stove, by the time that you realize that it's hot, you've already pulled your hand away from the stove. And the reason why is because the signal comes from your hand, it goes to your spinal cord, it integrates within the spinal cord, and then comes back to your hand to cause the motor response to pull your hand back. It's automatic. And it occurs much quicker because it has a shorter distance to travel. Another example would be in the knee-jerk reaction. And I have a picture coming up in a couple slides. But what the doctor does is he hits you on the knee, which is going to elongate one of the ligaments in your knee, which causes your knee to kind of jerk and kick out. It's kind of one of the reasons why when you fall, you traditionally put your hands and your legs out to kind of protect yourself. Okay, so here's the diagram, and you see that the doctor has hit you with this small rubber hammer, and what that does is that's causing a lengthening of this ligament right here. And so when he hit it, it kind of causes that to lengthen, and that's picked up right here in our sensory neuron within our quadricep muscle. And so the signal is going to go along that sensory neuron. It's then going to integrate here in the gray matter of the spinal cord. And it's going to determine that the appropriate response is to contract the quadricep muscle and relax the hamstring muscle, which is going to cause your leg to jerk out, thus protecting you. So now the brain and the spinal cord have two different kind of types of cells that make up the types of neurons. You have gray matter, and the gray matter usually is made up of the neuron cell bodies, the dendrites, and the unmyelinated axons. While the white matter consists of myelinated axons. So that myelin, those the myelin sheath, the Schwann cells, and the oligodendrocytes that surround the axon, those are traditionally white cells. And so if we have an area where there's a whole bunch of those, then of course that area tends to be myelinated, tends to be white. So here you can see on our diagram, our gray matter in the brain is on the outside, and the white matter is on the inside. So if we think for a second about that the signal travels a lot faster in white matter than it travels in gray matter, we would understand that the reason why the white matter is on the inside is to protect that white matter, and is to allow for the integration and the advanced thinking that must occur within our brains. So now we've talked before about the peripheral nervous system and how it's transporting information from and to the central nervous system. You're bringing in all these sensations. It's traveling along the sensory neuron, which is all part of the peripheral nervous system. It gets into the central nervous system for integration, and then the signal travels back out through the peripheral nervous system on a motor neuron. Well, we want to make things a little complicated like we always do. So in our peripheral nervous system, we have two different types of neurons. You have afferent neurons and efferent neurons. So if it's a sensory neuron, it's going to be an afferent. So sensory afferent neurons transmit information to the central nervous system. And efferent neurons are going to transmit the information away from the central nervous system. So the way that I remember it is by saying sensory, afferent, motor, efferent. So along the sensory neurons, the ones that are bringing in the sensations, that's going to go along the afferent neurons. And the motor neurons, which have your response or your effector, are going to go along the efferent neurons. And then we also have cranial nerves that occur inside of your brain, and they terminate within the organs of the head and upper body. And then, of course, our spinal nerves that are going to originate in the spinal cord and extend to parts of the body below the head. So there's two main components of the peripheral nervous system. You have your motor system and you have your autonomic nervous system. So the motor system is traditionally going to be voluntary. You're thinking about doing this thing. You're thinking about moving your arm. You're thinking about writing on your paper. You're thinking about running. Now, you're not sitting here logically going step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, but you're making a conscious decision to run somewhere. So these would be considered voluntary muscles. Your autonomic nervous system regulates the internal environment in an involuntary manner. You're not thinking about increasing your blood pressure. You're not thinking about vasodilation, vasoconstriction. You're not thinking about breathing. Like if you had to sit there every moment and think about taking a breath in, there would be no time to think about anything else. You're not thinking about pushing the food throughout your small intestines and your stomach and your esophagus after you've eaten. All of that is part of that autonomic nervous system. That is automatic and it's going to happen no matter what. You don't have to think about doing that. So there are three main divisions within the autonomic nervous system. Your sympathetic, your parasympathetic, and the enteric system. Okay, so the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, these have antagonistic effects to them, in which your sympathetic is your fight or flight, and the parasympathetic is rest and digest. So when you're getting really worked up and worried about something, you gotta fight some evil, you're anxious about something, that's your sympathetic nervous system, or the sympathetic division. And after you've eaten a big meal, Thanksgiving, you're just hanging on the couch, that's your parasympathetic. That's the rest and the digest and the just chill moments, okay? And the enteric division has to do with your GI tract, your gastrointestinal tract, in which you're going to be moving things throughout your GI tract. So as I said before, the sympathetic division corresponds with the fight or flight response. Parasympathetic is your rest and digest, and the enteric controls the activity of the digestive system, the pancreas, and of course your gallbladder. So within our brainstem, we've got a couple different kind of sections. Okay, there's three parts. You have your midbrain, which is right here. You have your pons, and then you have the medulla oblongata. Now, it's not going to be important for you to know all these parts, but it's going to kind of be important that you kind of have a general idea that there are these different parts and that they all have different jobs. So the midbrain's job is it contains the center for kind of receiving and the integration of the sensory information, while your pons is in charge of controlling the breathing in the medulla. So like if you were to injure your pons, there's a chance that you might not breathe appropriately, which would be a big problem. And then medulla oblongata kind of controls several things, including breathing, cardiovascular activity, swallowing, vomiting, digestion. So this is very essential. And if you were to get injured and hurt your brainstem in any of these parts, it could be life-threatening, or you could just you might have to be put on a ventilator. There would be a lot of problems. So please protect your necks. Here we see the cerebellum. We usually call the cerebellum the little brain. Its job is for coordination and error checking during motor, perceptual, and then cognitive functions. So whenever you think about like muscle memory, this is the cerebellum that's working on that. So it's involved in your learning as well as your motor skills. So here we have the kind of more of the inner part. This is where we have the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. I think you could probably figure out that epithalamus is going to be above the thalamus, and then the hypothalamus, of course, is going to be below the thalamus. And so the diencephalon is making up all of these three regions. The epithalamus is in charge of the pineal gland. If you remember, we looked at that before. That was where the melatonin was generated or synthesized. And then we also have the making of this cerebral spinal fluid. The thalamus is going to be the main center for our sensory information, input and output. And then the hypothalamus is important for regulating. You saw in all of our mechanisms that we looked at for the endocrine system that the hypothalamus was involved in almost every single one of them. And so it helps with basic survival like feeding, fighting, fleeing, and of course reproducing. And then we talk about the cerebrum. This is where we have the right and the left hemispheres. And the cerebral hemisphere is actually made up of gray matter that sits on top of white matter, as you saw a couple slides ago. And so within this, there's actually different regions, and each of those regions actually have different functions. So between the left and the right hemispheres, there's actually this thick band of axons called the corpus callosum, and that's what actually allows the communication between the right and the left hemispheres. So that's why your tongue moves all at one unit, because of the fact that you've got the right and the left actually working together and able to communicate between the two, which is really cool because the right half of your body is controlled by the left half of your brain, and and the left half of your body is controlled by the right half of your brain, which is really cool in my opinion. So each side of the cerebral cortex actually has different lobes. So you have your frontal lobe, which is in charge of your personality, your speech, and your motor cortex. Back in the day in mental institutions, they would do this thing called a lobotomy, in which they would come in and kind of scramble the frontal lobe to try to change the personality of these patients. Your temporal lobe is in charge of kind of your hearing and your smell. Your occipital lobe is in the back of your head, and it's in charge of kind of your vision and your visual association. And then the parietal lobe is up on the top sides, and this is in charge of the somatosensory cortex, your speech, your taste, and also reading. So here you can see what I was just mentioning, how the frontal lobe is kind of, it's our personality, but we also have the frontal association area. We have speech, and we have, of course, motor complex. Parietal is for our somatosensory. We have speech and taste and also reading. The occipital is in charge of the vision. Temporal is your smell and your hearing, and a couple of things like that. But it's not important for you guys to know all of these different lobes. I just wanted to show them to you so you kind of had an idea of different parts of your brain. And that brings us to the end of chapter 49. I do want you to work on the mouse party activity. Mouse party is going to show you how different neurotransmitters interact within your brain, and how drugs are going to affect those different neurotransmitters.